And try this option as well. Go ahead.
Okay. Hello to everybody. Joanne Freeman here. I don't know what week we're in now for History Matters, and so does coffee, but it's been a good number of them. I think maybe this is the 5th week, maybe? I don't know. The weeks all flow together when you're hanging out in your apartment. But this week, as advertised on Twitter, we're going to be talking about the press. And I'm going to be focused largely on, as you're going to see today, and then I'm going to have part 2 next Thursday, because there's a lot to say about the press. But I'm going to be talking about how it worked, what the sort of founding generation thought about newspapers and why they were important. Next week, I'm probably going to be talking about relationships between presidents and the press. I'm going to come back to why and why I think this is important, but that's going to be the topic today. And I'm going to turn things over to Matt in a moment, but what he is wonderfully doing right now is that ideally there will be an 18th century newspaper or part of one that you can look at while I'm talking today. And even if it's not entirely up by the time we're talking today, it will be up for people to read in more detail later. But for a moment, I'm going to turn things over to Matt. So okay, I see that it is week 6, not 5. I don't want to jip us out of our record. Okay, week 6. Okay, so Matt, why don't you give us instruction about how to ask questions?
Yes, well, welcome everybody, and to week 6, and we'll let Joanne get going here in just a second. It's if this is your first time, as usual, we like folks to try to put in where you're from in the chat, and you feel free to make comments as long as they're, classroom appropriate. And we will be sure to try to be attentive to those as we go through. If you do have questions for Joanne, we ask that you put them in the Q&A tab, which is at the bottom of the screen. Click on Q&A, put in your question, and we will get to those when we get to the Q&A part of the event. In the meantime, if you do like this kind of programming and you do enjoy these kinds of conversations, join us at nche.net. We have membership options, and of course, we have lots and lots of programming that we do. So we really hope that you will join us and see the kind of work that we're doing, not just for events like this, but we do work across the spectrum to support education, history education, and history. So any kind of support you can give is welcome, and that's my spiel. So turn it over to Joanne. I'm going to hide away and let the good professor do her work.
Okay. Do this to get us going. Okay, here we go. Okay, so as I suggested a moment ago, and I mentioned it, I think yesterday on Twitter, online in Twitter land, in social media land, one of the topics that I get asked about most or lectured on most, that always provokes a big response, is the press. People want to know if they're asking a question, they want to know if this is the worst it's ever been. If they're not asking a question, they're insisting it's the worst it's ever been. There's obviously, for any number of reasons, there's a lot of thought and emotion going into the press and what it is and isn't doing at this moment. And so part of what I want to do today and then next Thursday is talk a little bit about what assumptions were in early America about, in general, what newspapers were supposed to do, why they were important in a democratic republic, and then, as I suggested a few moments ago, what has been the relationship between presidents of the United States and the press, because as you'll hear, I suppose if you were going to sum up what I'm going to say today and next Thursday, I would say there is no golden, beautiful period for the American press, right? There, I think probably very often in the founding period, people look back to that period and they imagine it somehow as being this sort of golden period in which everyone agreed about things and the press was nice and everyone sat in their seat in Congress and all of these wonderful things happened. And if you're a political historian, one of the things you learn really quickly about early America is no, there is no beautiful golden period. And of course, customs change over time and there is more or less violence, but we're going to get a little sense for the next 2 sessions about what the press was like. Now, one of the things, I'm glancing at my notes here, one of the things that's interesting about newspapers in the early United States is that even when foreign visitors came to the United States, one of the things that they noticed was, and I think there's even a quote from someone from France who says that Americans are a newspapered people, that they're so focused on newspapers and everybody talks about newspapers and they're handing newspapers to other people and they're reading newspapers aloud, and newspapers were a really big deal, not just in the early Republic, but in revolutionary America as well, and then straight through. Just to give you a sense of that, I actually researched numbers for you today. And I will say, I'm going to come back in a moment to what newspapers looked like and what they did. When I talk about newspapers, I'm actually talking about, I'll come back to this, a 4-page document. An average subscription rate for a newspaper in this period was 500, right? So 500 people is kind of average. A big newspaper got to maybe, had a subscription list of maybe 2,500 people. So we're not talking anything remotely close to not only modern, but even the 19th century. But newspapers were read out loud. They were passed from person to person. In some of my research, I've actually managed to track a single copy of the newspaper it's sent from one person to another, and then from that person to another. So newspapers had a wider reach than an individual copy. But so in 1790.
Joanne, I'm sorry to interrupt. This is Matt. The newspaper is available on our website now. So
wonderful. Okay, thank you. Excellent.
It's all set. So I apologize for interrupting, but I thought you wanted.
No, that's good, because I wanted it to be there. So thank you very much. In 1790, there were roughly 500,000 newspapers being mailed out for a population of 3.8 million. There were a lot of newspapers. And as I said, when you count in reading and aloud and sharing, they were, as someone put it at the time, the channel of information in America, the way to communicate. And again, you have to sort of cast your mind back and realize that that's it, right? That you're either writing letters, reading pamphlets, or reading newspapers. And newspapers are by far the broadest reaching public means of communication in this time period. Now, as you're going to see today, when I talk about this newspaper, they were really kind of a blend of things. They tended to be 4 pages long, and the pages tended to follow a similar format. So the front page very often would have foreign news. The second page would very often have domestic news. The third page would have local news, and then the back very often would have ads and occasional poetry. And that was kind of it, right? So that's when you look at a newspaper in this period, that's pretty much what you see, not always. And the newspaper today actually doesn't quite fit that mold, but it comes close. Now, they were seen from a very early point, and this is, I suppose, one of the main points that I want to make today for better and worse. It was assumed that newspapers were politically important, and that was assumed in several different ways. So the sort of loftier way, which I'm going to start with, is the assumption was that newspapers and the press generally was a tool of accountability, right? So how do you keep a government accountable? Well, you have a press that watches what they're doing and reports it. And of course, we're going to get into other questions about if they're being accurate or not, but still, the idea was the press is a tool of accountability, and particularly in a republic. So, and the United States is a republic, and that's a kind of an experimental mode of government, and it's grounded on public opinion. In that kind of government, it's really important for the people to be informed about what their leaders are doing. So Thomas Jefferson at one point says that that the newspapers are vitally important because, as he puts it, they are a curb on politicians. They hold them back because they know that they're being watched. A second account, and I found this, let me grab it over here. William Maclay, I talked about his diary a couple of weeks back. So in his diary, he notes, and at that point, this is from 1791, the Senate doors were closed, so the press wasn't yet allowed in. And he writes in his diary, and this has to do, they're debating a national bank, right? So it's a charged issue, and it's Hamilton, and there's a lot going on. Maclay writes, after watching that debate, being part of that debate, realizing that there's no press present, he says, "I am now more fully convinced than ever I have been at the propriety of opening our doors. I am fully confident some gentlemen would have been ashamed to have seen their speeches of this day reflected in a newspaper of tomorrow." So there's a really concrete assumption that that's the role that the press is intended to play politically. It's like almost a branch of government, right? Newspapers are vital, and accountability is vital in our form of government. So you can see that they're important in that way. However, they're also important politically because objectivity is not on the table in this period as far as the press is concerned. Objectivity comes along in the 19th century. At this point, newspapers are sponsored by sometimes one political side or another. Sometimes they're commercially oriented, merchants, there are a lot of commercial gazettes of various sorts, but a good many newspapers are sponsored by a group of politicians of similar politics, and that's what it's for, is to promote their politics. And you're going to hear today in the newspaper that we look at the sort of weird blend of news and reports and pragmatic things and things that everyone needs to know about, and then crazy partisan politics all bundled up into one newspaper. So you kind of get a sense of how important they were as communication, political and otherwise. I mean, I remember when I was writing my first book, there was a Massachusetts politician writing letters to people in the capital, which I think was Philadelphia at the time. And he was basically saying in his letters, "Someone tell me what's going on down there because we're not getting our newspapers right now and I'm in the dark," which was a really wonderful image, right? I can't see what's happening. I need someone tell me something. I'll write letters to important people I know because I don't have the newspapers. Okay, so what I want to do, and I'm not going to open the newspaper on my screen because I handily printed out a copy for me to look at. I am going to ask, is it possible, can you guys, I'm going to open chat. Do you guys, is it possible for you? Do you have the ability to open the newspaper? Yes. Yay! Okay, wonderful. So what I did today, I did not want to find some spiffy, wonderful, special newspaper to show you. I actually really wanted to find something random that would represent kind of a typical newspaper. I went to the year 1800 because a very fraught presidential election was coming up in November. I went to May in 1800 so that I could see, well, okay, here we are, May of 1800, an election is the same number of months away. What does a newspaper look like? And the paper I pulled up is The Guardian or the New Brunswick Advertiser. The titles of these newspapers, they're long and sometimes they change. Owners change, papers come and go, close and open. So when you're researching them, you have to really be not very strict about the title you're looking for because they change all the time. But in this case, at this moment in 1800, from New Brunswick, New Jersey, The Guardian or New Brunswick Advertiser. Now, if you can see the first page, kind of like I said before, in this case, there are a number of ads there. There's a ladies' boarding school that has an ad. There's a couple actually educational things for sale. The main item on the first page takes up the second two columns, and it's actually just a list of acts from Congress. Now, I believe this is May 30th. It's so tiny that I can't read it. But at any rate, not very long before this, May 14th, Congress had closed its session. So what they're doing is saying, okay, now that the congressional session is closed, We're going to talk about what that Congress did. We're going to list that here. So that's pragmatic. That's kind of what you would expect, right, in a newspaper. Handy to have them all listed here. So there's nothing surprising about that. And it's kind of logical. And it has taken the place of what might have been an important story about foreign news. So that, there you go. The first page basically has one item of news on it. You turn the page, and then they begin talking about domestic politics, about the public debt of the United States. Again, it turns more to domestic politics on this page. Before I get to page 3, I want to go to page 4 because I'm going to come back to page 3. Page 4, as you'll see, is, as I suggested before, mostly ads. In this case, and it probably has to do with the fact that it's May, a lot of horses are available for mares to mate with. And apparently $10 was the going rate, I learned reading this newspaper for you this morning. So on the back, more advertisements, and in this case, practical if you need to be breeding horses in some way information. But now I want to go to page 3. So until now, most of what we've been talking about is pretty typical of a newspaper. It's mostly news and local, you know, things that are up for sale. How else would you know what's in town and new as far as goods are concerned, unless you could actually see in the newspaper, oh, there's a shipment of whatever in town now. Wonderful, I'll go get it. On the third page of the newspaper, you'll see the second column about halfway down. It says, from a Boston paper. And it says, and I need to read this because it needs to be read. It says, the 5 alternatives now presented to the people of the United States. Reader, ponder them with seriousness. So this, they're now thinking, as you'll hear, they're not saying the election, they're thinking about the election. And it's important, and you better be serious in thinking about it. So here are the 5 alternatives that appear to be confronting the United States as we're heading up to this election. So what will happen in the election? Well, number 1, first, either a total change in the officers of government with the annihilation of the debt of the nation and a total relaxation of all the measures of national defense, and further, such alterations in the Constitution as will enervate and destroy the executive and Senate, leaving the country a prey to popular passions. Okay, that doesn't sound very good, so we don't want that alternative. Number 2, second alternative that will happen because of this election, a dissolution of the Union, followed by a period of final erection of 2 or more separate confederacies in which Virginia will aim to place herself at the head of the Southern. Okay, now you're kind of getting a sense of where we're moving with this. The third possible alternative coming out of this election, an attempt to form a confederation similar to the old one, which cannot be effected, and if it could, would produce jealousies and rivalries which must end in civil war. That's unfortunate, which must crush some of the states, and probably the largest, as they are not a match for their weaker neighbors combined. Or, fourth possible, not very desirable outcome of that election, an ultimate appeal to arms by the 2 great parties throughout the Union, without the distinction of states, which, should the awful calamity take place, must cover our land with blood and end in a monarchy supported by a standing army. That does not sound good either. Now, I'm going to keep going here, but it's important to note that they're not listing this here. Remember the first week, some of you may not have been here. The first week I read a letter, a memo that Hamilton wrote about what he thought might happen next, having just had the Constitution, that it was just ratified, so what's going to happen next? Actually, it was just written, it was on its way to being ratified, and he was trying to predict what would happen next. And he has all of these weird, you know, maybe this, maybe that, maybe the Union will divide into confederacies or the states will turn against each other. Some of these very options here were in that memo. So as I'm reading these here, these writers are not trying to be cute, right? They're actually in some way reflecting what some people believed were actual options. It's easy to forget that. The government at this point is not yet, I mean, you know, it kicks in 1789, we're in 1800. That's how old the government is. That's how long they've been abiding by the Constitution. So any of these options, contingency, that's what I talked about that first week, any of these options might have been possible. So they're really, by putting this here, they're saying, they mean it. Ponder this with seriousness, folks, because any of these are possible. Then they finally say, people of America, citizens of Massachusetts, the alternatives are before you. Take your choice. But blessed be God who has hitherto provided us a fifth alternative. A fifth alternative remains, which if you are not wanting to yourselves, may yet save us from the ruin which impends over our head. This is in your power. It is legal, constitutional, honorable, and practicable. Rise in the majesty of your strength, and this is all italicized. Elect to offices none but decided friends to our present Constitution. Crush the monster faction. They're letting it all out now. The friends of Mr. Jefferson declare there can be no conciliation with the friends of Mr. Adams and are determined to go all lengths to accomplish their object. The pacific overtures of Mr. Adams to the French Republic, so much applauded by the Jeffersonian party, have been industriously improved to remove him, Adams, from the chair of government and to exalt their favorite infidel chief, Jefferson, to his place. There is great reason to fear they will succeed. In this case, the miseries of a revolution await you. Rise then, attend to your elections, advance to office none but good and tried men, and you may yet save the Constitution, the bulwark of your peace, prosperity, and freedom. Okay, that's not, to say that that's partisan is an understatement, right? That's not, here's the acts of Congress, we got some, horses that can be mated, they're discussing public debt in Congress. And by the way, if Jefferson becomes president, we're all going to kill each other and the nation will be covered in blood. And that's the newspaper, right? So that kind of gives you a sense of the weird blend of practical and common and straightforward and partisan. I saw flitting by someone say, well, at least the partisanship is on the table. And yeah, there was no question really that newspapers were partisan, although it was very popular of newspapers in this period to say, we are open to all opinions, right? We want to have a public debate. And yet I found very often people of one political persuasion trying to get into a newspaper of another political persuasion and being told, gosh, there's no room for you. So even that is perhaps not real. But yes, the partisanship is really open. And I'm as far as the newspaper goes, I'm going to stop there because that little Civil War angsty moment is going to be a nice segue to talking next week about presidents and the press. But before I drop off here and open up for questions, I want to mention briefly, as I always do, I pivot to the present to relate what we're talking about when it comes to history to the present. And I guess, I think when we think about the press today, we need to think about the fact that the American press has always been problematic, has always been full of truths and falsehoods, has always been partisan in some way. It's been partisan in different ways, and in some periods less or more so. It becomes more sensational in what it has in it in the 19th century, but still, my larger point is, it's not as though now is horrible, the press is terrible, it needs to be suppressed because it's so bad. It has always been bad, and that's not necessarily a bad thing because, as I started out by saying, a free press is vital to any democratic mode of governance. Yes, it is going to be, a free press is going to be full of weirdness and accusations and everything else, but it's the only real way. The fact that it's free means that it can be a tool of accountability, means that people can look for and hopefully present things with evidence, right? But that people can hold people in power accountable. That's part of what the press is supposed to do. Look and see what's going on, find ways to prove it, reveal it to the public. The other half of that equation is that we as consumers of what's going on in the press, we need to be smart consumers. So rather than say the press is horrible and it's worse than it's ever been, well, it isn't. But we need to be smart consumers because they're so important, because they're really ways in which we either can or can't know what's going on. We're in a moment, obviously, when knowing what's real and not real and true and false is very hard to tell. That doesn't mean we can't be smart consumers. That doesn't mean we should read something and automatically assume it's true and go running off down the pike, you know, screaming about what's going on. It means we should be smart. We should step back. We should think about what's going on. I mentioned before when I talked about feelings, right? That when something politically, particularly in this moment, grabs your feelings and inspires you to want to have an outburst of a response, that's a great moment to step back and think about why that might be happening. What is the goal of this thing that's trying to get you all emotional? Is there some other purpose in mind? Be a smart consumer. And so part of what I want to say is that, yes, for all that we can complain about the press today, what's going on now was always assumed to be part of the price of a free press. That doesn't mean that a free press is any less important. Next week, I'm going to talk about presidents confronting an unfriendly press and how that went down, because that also happens. Even George Washington got bad press. And next week, I'm going to get to read one or two documents that I dearly love that relate to this. So the question really will be, you know, what do we think of today's press? What do we think it should be doing? What do we want it to do? And in what ways are we asking questions that can happen or that can't happen? In what ways are we neglecting to protect a democratic governance? All of these are things we need to think about, because I think it's very easy, and it always has been, to condemn a free press because of everything in it that isn't reliable, that is exaggerated or is just fake. And I just think that's an easy way out. And by dismissing it in that way, you deprive the nation of its most fundamental tool for figuring out what's actually going on. And that's newspapers, the press in a variety of different ways, journalists asking questions, people either answering the questions or not, but in one way or another, that process, the process of seeking and finding or not finding information, that's our best way to begin to figure out what's going on. So I'm getting very emotional and passionate about this because I feel this so strongly, and because I can feel so often on social media the degree to which people feel emotional about this. And I just want people to pause and think before they easily dismiss a press, today's press, as being bad and thus needs to be banished. We will be in very, very sad shape if we don't have a free press. And even the presidents in the past, you'll see Jefferson, you'll see Washington, even as they were screaming about what was in the newspapers, they didn't say, end a free press. They screamed and they were pretty upset. We'll talk about that. But it's important to think about the purpose of a press, the political purpose of a press, not just partisanship, but the way in which it's built into a democratic politics. And that's just as true today as it was in the founding era. And I think looking at the weird mix of things that I just showed you in one average newspaper shows you the ways in which it's always a hodgepodge. You always have to think about what you're seeing. There's always an attempt to kind of goad you into thinking something one way or another. And you buy the newspaper you want, you read the newspaper you want. In this period, people would often buy conflicting newspapers and they would argue with each other, and people would read both sides. And you see sometimes in newspapers, one paper will say, well, you know, Y newspaper said blah, 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 blah. We don't think that. And then Y newspaper will say, well, I know X newspaper doesn't believe it, but here's why we think it's true. So that there's sometimes actually conversations going on in newspapers, which that's a good thing. If partisan sides are actually debating each other, and some of those debates are more like Civil War, bloodshed, life is over, but still, all of that, as problematic as it can be, is vitally important. Okay, I'm gonna stop, I'm gonna get off my soapbox here and open things up so that people can ask questions. Oh, but before I do, I forget to do this every time. Someone already saw what my mug was. It's my C-SPAN book TV mug. C-SPAN, I thought, qualifies as the press in its own way, although it's really presenting, generally speaking, just what's going on, and historians like me blathering, but still, this is my thematic mug for the day. I panic every week, like, What am I going to find in there? Yesterday, I was pulling mugs out of my cabinet. It's like, when do I run out? But for this week, at least, I am on theme with my mug.
And by the way, your keynote is on C-SPAN. The keynote from the NCHE National Conference this year that you did is on C-SPAN, C-SPAN 3, as we know. And apparently they're still running it almost daily. Which we're very excited about. So, but you can also watch the video on their site, and if you need that link, you can email me, and I'll be happy to send that to you.
Book TV is a fine thing, and I have to say, I love this mug because I got it when I was on C-SPAN being interviewed, and then they handed me the mug when I left, and so it's kind of an honored, in the same way that my Idaho mug is an honored mug. This is also an honored mug. Okay, now I will. I will open things up to questions.
Excellent. Let's get some questions. Let's see. There was a great one. Jason asked, is there a particular era of U.S. history where the press was especially effective at challenging those in power?
Especially effective. Well, I mean, I think in one way or another, it always did. You know, I mean, you jump ahead into the 19th century and you get technological innovations like steam-powered printing presses and railroads and the telegraph and other things that enable newspapers to spread more quickly and news to spread more quickly and to reach further. That certainly gives news a more immediate impact. That was some of what I was looking at in my most recent book. The Field of Blood is how politics changes when the news becomes more immediate, so that, you know, kind of like what Maclay referred to in my opening comments here, if someone stands up in Congress and says something crazy and 45 minutes later the nation knows about it, that's a different and immediate and potentially stronger kind of impact. But I think in the same way that people have always understood the importance of the press in a democratic politics, they've also been quite aware and not always happy with the fact that they can shape a politics. And in one way or another, I mean, I'm not going to talk about that in depth here, but a lot of people have written about and talked about the revolution and the ways in which newspapers gave people a sense of an us, united the different colonies so that they joined in shared cause, repeated in their newspapers things that appeared in other newspapers so that people could understand that what they were experiencing locally, other people were experiencing elsewhere. So, you know, I don't know if I would say there's a period when it's extreme. I would say the intensity of it changes in part when technology allows it to. And one last point along those lines. You know, the telegraph was a dramatic change in the way that politics and the press worked. Because as I just suggested, suddenly you couldn't stand up, say something outrageous, and then the next day go to the press office and say to them, don't print my comments, I don't want them in your paper. Suddenly, you lose that wiggle room as a politician, and it scrambles politics, and it kind of freaks out congressmen because they no longer have a hold on what's going on. Technology and democracy is not a new insight, but a really important one. Technology and democracy has a really profound impact on democracy, because democracy is a conversation between people and the people they put into office. Technology changes the conversation. The telegraph did that. Social media is doing that. And that's some of what we're experiencing now is a new-ish form of technology that's allowing people to communicate in a different kind of a way, in a more immediate way. And people have lost hold of the story and who controls it. And so, you know, as a historian, sometimes I'll sit back and look at this moment and think, when I'm able to not be upset by whatever's going on politically, wow, this is kind of interesting. You know, there was a moment when Democrats, I think in the House, had a sit-in and the cameras were turned off in the House. And so representatives picked up their phones and were broadcasting to the people, you know, to Americans through their phone. And it was like late at night. And I just stayed up watching that because as a historian, I thought, now that's fascinating. They're communicating with the public through their phones during this sit-in. They're just skipping the media, right? They're just directly communicating with the public. What does that mean? So all of these things are interesting and they can be transformative. But when they're happening, they can be disorienting, and we're in one of those moments.
So going back to some of the newspaper that you provided for today and others in the era, do you think they were written in such a, this is from Jennifer, do you think the articles were written in such a dramatic fashion because they knew it would be read aloud?
Oh, that's a really good question. That was probably part of it. I mean, part of it also was because they wanted people to read the dramatic parts. I'm going to show you one or two things next week that you want to see drama. I'll show you some drama, really getting close to the presidential election of 1800. But yeah, certainly they're assuming that people are going to be reading this aloud, and if they can get snappy things in the newspaper that are easily either read aloud or repeated, that stay in your mind, as I guess with the press in any time period, that's going to be effective. The other thing to bear in mind too is that language in the 18th century and their assumptions about what's normal and what aren't are different from ours. So, the most obvious example in a sense is everyone signing their letters, "Your humble and obedient servant. I have the honor to be your obedient servant." Hamilton lyrics. That's a convention. That's like, we say "yours truly." It's kind of extreme. "I have the honor to be your obedient servant," but that was the norm. If a letter, and I teach my students this, if a letter in this time period ends "affectionately yours," by 18th century standards, that's like, boom, that's like so emotional, so it's also worth bearing in mind conventions about what is normal and is not normal. Also, you kind of have to think about that. But I think generally the idea that if something looks like screaming loud in a newspaper in this period, it's probably meant to be screaming loud in a bunch of different ways.
That's fascinating. Two great questions here, back to back, Inger and Joanne, another Joanne. So I'll ask Joanne's question first. What kind of interesting differences do you see in the newspapers based on where they were published? Are Southern newspapers different than Northern, besides what we might think is obvious?
Interesting. In some ways they are. I mean, and in part that has to do with the fact that there are a lot more densely populated cities in the North. So in some ways that means there's more newspapers in the North. It means that it's easier for people to get their hands on them. When I was writing my first book, I remember tracking a Virginian who wanted to get a pamphlet printed and distributed. Now in Boston, someone could go to a printer in the middle of Boston, print the pamphlet, and then manage to get it distributed. This guy, who's from Western Virginia, he travels into Richmond, which is a trip. He's in Richmond and he has to find a printer who's free and able to print something. It takes him a little while. Then he does, and then it takes the printer a while to print the pamphlets, and then he doesn't know how to get them out of Richmond back home. And he ends up, anytime anyone comes to town in Richmond and is heading west, he gives them a bunch of pamphlets and says, "Could you take these with you? Because I want to get them west." And he couldn't carry them all by himself. So printing generally and distributing print in the South can be more challenging. Less print survives from the South in this period than the North, which is really paper-minded. But as far as partisanship and screaming Federalist or screaming Republican, Virginia was kind of a hub of the Jeffersonian Republicans, but there were Federalists there and vice versa, and there was plenty of screaming partisanship on both sides.
To what extent did the newspapers in the 18th century and early 19th century cater to their potential readers? Meaning, did they print stories, opinions they thought their readers would want to read? Or so in other words, in what ways were they doing this to continue an already existing narrative among their existing readership?
That's a good question. And the answer is kind of a mix. When I work with 18th century newspapers with my students, sometimes they want to write papers about public opinion about whatever. And really the only way you can come close to figuring out public opinion is to go and read, the great databases you have now, where you can say, what are a massive number of newspapers. What are northern newspapers saying about this topic? What are southern newspapers saying about the topic? What does that suggest about public opinion in the North and South? And in some ways, that gets at that to a degree. However, as you're suggesting, newspapers are sometimes reflecting public interest and sometimes trying to sway public interest. So they're a mix of things. And certainly I don't think newspapers in general are, as I said at the outset, attempting to be objective presenters of news. So in a way, they see their job as showing people the truth. And the truth can be really partisan. You know, it also depends on what kind of newspaper. If there's a commercial newspaper, it might be way less screaming as the little article in the one that I just showed you. So it kind of depends, but I think it's kind of both. Okay. It's trying to sway people, and it's also trying to reflect interest so people will buy the newspaper. So it's a mix.
A piggyback question to that then is has to do with the literacy rate at the time. How many people were, so I'm combining a couple questions, Larry and Pam. Like how many people were capable of reading the newspaper? What was the sort of reading level of the people that were reading newspaper? And was information then disseminated in other ways from the newspaper?
Good questions. Okay, so I don't have numbers. I can tell you that literacy was higher in the North than in the South. Even as late as, I don't know, the 1850s, one of the congressmen that I wrote about in my last book is angsting over the fact that people back home in his constituency, they just can't read. And he's ashamed and kind of mortified about illiteracy in Virginia, and he wants that to be improved. So there is that difference in Northerners, and it partly has to do with Puritans and, you know, needing to read the Bible for yourself. But literacy is always higher in the North than in the South. I totally just lost track of the rest of that question. What was the other part of that question? I
had moved. I was looking at another question while you were talking.
North versus South literacy.
So the question is, what was the literacy rate in around that time? How many people were capable of reading newspaper?
Right.
What was the sort of the lexile level, or what sort of the reading level? And then what does that sort of suggest about how information was disseminated?
Right.
That's part to me.
Thank you. I don't, like I said, I don't have numbers, but what I can say is reading newspapers aloud at coffee houses, at taverns, was really common. So that to some degrees, literacy mattered. And in other ways, if you went to a tavern or coffee house, odds were someone was going to be reading aloud and you would get it that way. So there were different ways of getting at that news. Post offices, I found when I was researching my first book, a lot of people, you know, newspapers get delivered to the mail, and then they would come and people would stand in the post office and demand that someone read from the newspaper they got. So there were all kinds of ways that people were getting news, even without being able to read.
Excellent. So Ash, it says Ash Key. I don't know if that's a typo, if that's supposed to be Ashley or Ash Key, but she asks, or he, I'm not sure. To piggyback off of the comments Joanne just made about how other papers would include comments from another, is that something that's fallen off? And if so, do you feel that it's something we've lost, that sense of collective us as a result? So kind of two parts of that. Do you see the same kind of phenomenon where newspapers are talking to each other? And do you feel like, if not, and I think she thinks not, do you feel like that changes sort of the narrative about the collective sense of us?
Well, I mean, to a degree, yes.
It's a loaded question. I apologize, but I thought
no, it's okay. Yeah, I do think that affects things. I mean, I do think, despite the fact that these newspapers are partisan and they're promoting one, you know, party, faction, whatever you want to call it, over another, there was an assumption that some kind of discussion needed to happen, right? And I don't know if I'd say it always created a we, but it certainly was abiding by the idea that there had to be some kind of debate that included many sides. Like, you couldn't we always use the term siloed now, that you couldn't go off and be siloed, and a republic wouldn't function that way. So I think that is assumed. And I think that public debate, just like political debate, public debate is assumed to be part of a democracy, the working of a democracy. I think now we don't see conversation really almost anywhere of that kind between different sides. I think that's a problem. I think we've lost track, both in the government and outside of the government, of the fact that this is a form of government based on debate and compromise. We're not doing really well on either of those fronts right now. So yeah, I do think it affects and reflects how a government is working and what it can and can't do. I don't know the answer to what happens in this moment. What's the outcome of social media and the way it's affecting politics? I don't think anyone knows that, but that's tied up with this too.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask one last question, and that is, and first of all, I apologize to anybody who we didn't get to your questions. There are a lot of questions about kind of today. We're trying to stick in the historical context as much as we can. So my apologies for not reading those questions. Feel free to contact us, and we can always try to get those questions to Joanne. Or you could list the questions for Joanne on the form, which we'll send out a little bit later, early next week. Last question is, you mentioned this briefly, this idea that newspapers should report the news in an objective and impartial way emerged in the 19th century. Can you talk a little bit about that? Where did we come up with this idea that newspapers should be completely objective, or at least try to be?
Yeah, try, I think, is the...
Yeah, I think that's the appropriate word, is try.
It's partly tied in with the press and newspapers becoming more of an independent enterprise and less tied in with being the tool of a party. I for example, one of the things I noticed, and I believe the 1850s, is that all of a sudden you have reporters interviewing members of Congress and then reporting their conversation. Like, what do you think about this? What we take for granted today. What do you think about that bill? And some congressmen thought this was interesting. Others didn't like this at all, because what do you mean you're just going to take down my words and report what I said? I'm used to going to the newspaper office and seeing what you're going to print and editing what you're going to put in. What do you mean you're just going to? So there were attempts to reflect more what was going on and less to be an obvious, I guess what they would have called it is, organ of a party. Over time, like I said, maybe more so later, well, at the same time that sensationalist presses and newspapers are rising, there's also some attempt to try and be objective. You can kind of see why those two things would happen at the same time. The problem with talking about objective news is, even as I sit here and say it became more of a goal, no press really, or few, ever can achieve that kind of absolute objectivity. So to some degree, in the same way that history, we try to be objective and then we're always in some ways subjective, that's kind of true of the press. I think the difference, and the thing to think about, and this has to do with today as well, is the goal versus the outcome. What are people trying to do with the press, and what are they actually doing, and how do those compare? And we can think about that. We can ask that about presses today as well. The last thing I'll say that's above and beyond questions is just, I'll come back to this next week, but one theme of today's comments, and will be again on Thursday, is a democratic politics is not passive. You have to be an active consumer. You have to be active and reading and acting and considering and weighing and moving and pushing. And, I think for a long time, we took for granted the fact that the government seemingly goes of itself, and it doesn't. So part of what each week, I suppose in a different way, I keep saying over and over again is, we have to be active citizens. And particularly in this moment when we know that there are decisions being made that could be vitally important, we have to be prepared to think and reason and process and act. I think we are doing that more than I've seen for a long time in my lifetime, however long or short it is. But I think that's really important, and I'll come back to that next week.
I think that's a terrific way to end. So thank you, everybody. And thank you for all lots of questions this week. Thank you. Lots to choose from. And I hope you bring this level of oomph to the conversation next week.
You guys always have oomph.
Yes, they do. They're fantastic questions. I wish, yeah, honestly, what we need is like a conversation that lasts for, like a whole afternoon, just so we can answer all these questions. But
that would be fun, and then I would fall out of my chair.
You would fall out of your chair, yeah. It'd be like more of a marathon than a sprint. But thank you, everybody, for joining us this week, and we will look forward to seeing you next week, Thursdays, 10 a.m. History Matters, and so does coffee.
So does coffee.
And we will take on the second part of the press next week. So we're really looking forward to that conversation. In the meantime, please join us at nche.net and /conversations if you want to see old episodes or if you want access to any of the documents or anything like that.
And I want to say, along the lines of what we're saying here, because yesterday I was at this board meeting talking about how meaningful this kind of thing is to me, and how we're in the moment where I think also we're kind of reshaping the ways in which information is being communicated and how cultural events happen. It means a lot to me that we do this weekly, that I can literally sit in the corner of my room and talk to you and engage with you about history in a way that has meaning to me and makes me feel that I am doing something useful. And to have you respond, this is an amazing thing to me. It falls into the category of being a good citizen, thinking about these things, thinking about how history can help us in the present. So I kind of want to thank you for showing up, because I think our doing this here is meaningful.
Totally agree.
I will see you guys next week. And I'm